There was a Venezuelan who was able to form a solid and modern state from the ruins in a country marked by more than 50 years of instability and wars. It was such a monumental task that it deserves a merit that very few men enjoy in history. His life as a hard-working landowner and as a military man before seizing power was as exceptional as the 27 years in which he ruled Venezuela. No one has managed to overcome the anarchic tendencies of our country so effectively. No one has governed Venezuelans for so long in peace, with so little opposition, and in a wave of constant development. However, over time, his detractors have described him as a tyrant who plunged Venezuela into misery. His name is Juan Vicente Gómez, also known as El Benemérito, and this is his great story. I invite you to support this initiative by subscribing to the channel, sharing this material if you find it valuable, and soon supporting us on our Patreon. I also remind you that the documentary and bibliographic support for all our videos can be found below in the description of the material. But let's continue then with the extraordinary story of the rehabilitator of Venezuela. Juan Vicente Gómez Chacón was born, like Simón Bolívar, on July 24, but in 1857. He grew up in one of the most remote areas of Venezuela, on a farm called La Mulera, which was located in the state. Táchira, whose property dated back to Juan Vicente's great-grandfather named Eleuterio Garcia Rovira, who was a captain of the patriotic cause of independence, and was the brother of another patriotic martyr close to the liberator, Simón Bolívar. It's quite curious to mention that Gómez descended both from heroes of the independence as well as from the first Spanish conquerors who populated this region. As part of his ancestry can be traced back to Pedro Gómez de Orozco, one of the conquerors who founded Bogotá, Ocaña, and Pamplona. However, his parents were far from being large landowners or figures linked to the Venezuelan social elite. Juan Vicente Gómez was born and raised in the mountainous region of the Venezuelan Andes. And it's important to emphasize that for various historical reasons, the inhabitants of the Venezuelan Andes developed a distinctive culture over the centuries of hard-working people, of methodical religious people, of large and cohesive families, of simple but calculating people, austere, introverted. A culture where there were no slaves and the landowners also worked the land directly. Contrary to what many believe, Juan Vicente Gómez was not illiterate. Although it is not known exactly where he learned to read and where he learned to write, it is possible that he learned in a small school within the same La Mulera estate. The numerous papers written by him, his own signatures, the annotations he made on the documents he received, and even his own poems confirm that Gómez was not this ignorant bumpkin, as his political adversaries have popularized. When his father dies in 1883, Juan Vicente Gómez would assume at 26 years old a great responsibility as the manager of the La Mulera estate and as the head of a large family, as he was the eldest of the siblings. While serving as the manager of the estate, Gómez gained a reputation for being a serious, hard-working, structured, austere, and good payer. In a short time, he managed to increase the productivity of the estate in the planting and marketing of coffee, as well as in the buying and selling of cattle. During this experience, he managed to significantly raise his family's economic position, as well as develop administrative skills that would be useful to him all his life. Gómez always maintained a simple and modest lifestyle as a working man, even while he was the absolute leader of Venezuela. The truth is that Juan Vicente Gómez stayed away from politics and power ambitions throughout this time. Until in 1888, in a cockfight, he asked to be introduced to Cipriano Castro, who was then governor of the Táchira section of the great state of the Andes. They became so close that Cipriano Castro was named the godfather of José Vicente, the first child that Gómez had with his wife, Dionisia Bello. The years passed, and in 1892, the legalist revolution of Joaquin Crespo against the constituted government of the then president of Venezuela, Raimundo Andueza, broke out. This revolution found strong support in certain areas of the Andes, and President Andueza appointed Cipriano Castro as the right man to fight the insurgents in Mérida and Táchira. Castro asks his compadre Juan Vicente Gómez to support him, and he agrees to accompany him on this new adventure as war commissioner, although his role in this war was supposed to be purely administrative, and even though he had no combat military experience. Juan Vicente Gómez participated in the Battle of Colón in March 1892 and fought with such intensity that he was promoted to the rank of colonel. However, the legalist revolution of Joaquin Crespo triumphed in the country, so Castro and his followers had to go into exile in Colombia. So Gómez, at the age of 35, also had to leave the country with almost his entire family. And he settled in a place just as close, on a farm near the border with Venezuela, where he basically devoted himself to re-establishing his businesses. Meanwhile, Castro continued to plot his political plans, which were very ambitious. To understand the relevance of Gómez, it is essential to contextualize that the 19th century in Venezuela was marked by intense wars and revolutionary instability. After the harsh War of Independence, the Federal War that broke out in 1859 did not bring peace at all, but more chaos from successive revolutions, and the creation of a political class of feudal warlords who made wars their means of living and their means to reach power. For a long time, it was a disaggregated country with an extremely weak state that did not fully control the national territory, nor did it guarantee the minimum conditions for development. This was still the reality of Venezuela in 1897 when Ignacio Andrade, the official candidate for the presidency of Joaquin Crespo's government, won the presidential elections in fraudulent elections against José Manuel Hernández, known as El Mocho Hernández. During Andrade's presidency, the country was experiencing a very difficult economic situation, in addition to the fact that Andrade's leadership was very weak and little respected. Was it really Joaquin Crespo who held the power? But his death in this last year accentuated the crisis that already existed. And in order to consolidate his power, Andrade set out to eliminate the current political territorial division that divided Venezuela into 7 large states and return to the old 20 states. Cipriano Castro from Cúcuta knew of the government's weakness and the seeming unconstitutionality of this territorial reform. It was the argument that served Castro as the flag of his revolution. In this way, in May of 1889, Cipriano Castro enters Venezuela, crossing the Táchira River with only 60 men, and proclaims the liberal restorative revolution from the town of Capacho in Táchira. Among those 60 men was Juan Vicente Gómez and several members of his family. Initially, Gómez hesitated to join the revolution due to his 6-year-old son Ali. According to him, he wrote on one of his papers when the war of May 23rd, "I thought about not coming because I didn't want to leave him alone, as seeing him that night lying in my bed, my pain was very great. To leave him without knowing what fate would befall me." End quote. But in the end, who could have stayed in a relatively comfortable life on his estate, decided to accompany his compadre in the liberal restoration revolution? In Táchira, more than 1,000 men joined him, forming the base of his army. Unable to take San Cristobal, after 2 months of battle, Castro makes an unexpected decision to march towards the country's capital. After a series of victories, the most decisive one occurred in Tocuyito. Added to a series of internal betrayals of the government and Castro's political cunning to negotiate with government members who no longer wanted to Andrade as president, they ended up giving the victory and power to Cipriano Castro. On October 22nd of 1899, 6 months after the uprising began, Cipriano Castro entered victorious into Caracas, under a downpour accompanied by Andean battalions, and several of the officers who had recently served Andrade Gómez had never set foot in the capital of Venezuela, and thus in a matter of months his life changed forever. During the war, Gómez climbed to the rank of general and won the position of second in command of the revolutionary movement. Since they entered Venezuela, Gómez dedicated himself to addressing all the logistical and material needs of the entire troop. And during the next years, Gómez maintained this paternal care over the Andeans, who often turned to him in the face of Castro's neglect or indifference when he was already in power. However, Gómez did not carry out any major military action during the course of this revolution. His reputation as a brilliant military strategist would come later. So in 1899, Cipriano Castro assumes the presidency of the Republic, and it marks the beginning of the period known as the Andean hegemony, a historical period of almost half a century in Venezuela, where they only led the governments. The Gauchos, that is, those from the mountainous region of the Venezuelan Andes, more specifically from the state of Táchira. President Castro faced his first problems in power immediately, coupled with the fact that he found a national treasury practically without money. General José Manuel Hernández, alias El Mocho, does not accept the victory of the restorative liberal revolution and immediately raises an anti-Castro guerrilla movement. The second problem was in the homeland of the revolutionaries. Táchira was under the command of Juan Pablo Peñalosa, who had not recognized Castro's government. In Cipriano Castro's opinion, the most suitable man to pacify and control Táchira was Juan Vicente Gómez. Before starting this new mission, Gómez held the position of governor of the federal district for a few months. At 42, he became the first person from Táchira to join Castro's cabinet. A cabinet, it should be noted, made up primarily of people from Valencia and Caracas from the old politics who had been members of previous governments. Gómez leaves his position to go to Táchira and embarks in La Guaira on several Navy ships, which take him to Maracaibo, where he continues his journey to the Andean region. Gómez sailed the sea for the first time. He finally reached his destination, but his adversaries had already fled. And there he was received with great popular enthusiasm, with a calm demeanor and an inclusive policy towards his adversaries, which he would maintain throughout his life. Gómez kept the Colombia border situation under control, despite the threat of invasion by dissident groups. He restores public order in the party, combats a smallpox epidemic, and carries out several public works. Gómez himself took money out of his pocket to help the destitute soldiers who had accompanied them since the beginning of the restorative liberal revolution. While Gómez was managing to restore peace in Táchira, a very serious problem was brewing in Caracas. Two relatives of President Castro came into conflict with Gómez because they accused him, without basis, of being a traitor and corrupt, in part because he was working with Castro's old adversaries. The stance of both of Castro's relatives greatly influenced the president. Castro finally decides to appoint his brother as president of Táchira. This bothered and disappointed Gómez, causing him to retire to his La Mulera estate. However, tempers were able to be calmed among all the actors, especially due to the growing threats from external enemies. Responding to Castro's request, Gómez returns to Caracas in 1901 and is appointed vice president of the country. But he was no longer the same upbeat advocate of the prior regime. He returned as a more experienced man who had already had a first encounter with the raw and real politics of Venezuela. But while all this was happening, a group of leaders who had been pushed away from the government, as well as others who were still part of it, began to seriously conspire against Castro. In this way, in December of 1901, the last civil war in the history of Venezuela, the so-called Liberating Revolution, broke out. This was a coalition of regional leaders led by the banker Manuel Antonio Matos, which was organized to overthrow the government of Cipriano Castro, with the help of transnational companies operating within the country who saw Castro's policy as a threat to their interests. With the thousands of dollars received from foreign agents in New York, Manuel Antonio Matos formed a powerful, heavily armed army to fight against the Castro government. The war began on December 19th when Luciano Mendoza, who was then the president of the state of Aragua and a supposed ally of Castro, proclaimed his rebellion in Villa de Cura. Other uprisings followed in various parts of the country. Castro immediately decides to promote Juan Vicente Gómez to division general and puts him in charge of a contingent of 1,500 men to fight against Luciano Mendoza. This was a new great responsibility with the peace of the Republic, which Gómez did not reject. It is worth mentioning that this was the largest coalition of rebel leaders in Venezuelan history which had been formed to overthrow a government. And also, Luciano Mendoza was a man with a broad military career and who also had the legendary fame of having been the one who defeated the hero of independence, José Antonio Páez. In turn, Mendoza had very well-prepared officers and subordinates in his army. And in contrast to all this, it was the first time that Gómez went on a campaign in command of an army. Even so, without hesitation or fear, Gómez took on this mission without knowing that he would become the pacifier of the homeland. Despite his limited experience, Gómez organized his military forces into 3 perfectly harmonized groups and showed great organizational and communication skills within his troops. Luciano Mendoza was getting ready to unite with another rebelling general, Antonio Fernández. Gómez. He prevented their meeting in the doorway corridor and in a short time managed to defeat both Fernández and the one who had defeated the legendary Páez, Castro. He sent him a telegram that said, "You finished with Mendoza, you finished with Fernández, now will you finish with the bandits of our Sierra Morena?" Armed with a Muser rifle and displaying remarkable bravery, Gómez continued towards Los Llanos, where he defeated a famous Mochista guerrilla fighter in Tinaco, who died riddled in the battle. The truth is that his first campaign in the center of the country was spectacular. In 65 days, Juan Vicente Gómez pacified the central region, defeating 3 great Venezuelan warlords. He traveled hundreds of kilometers on almost impassable roads and demonstrated, above all, that he mastered the art of war, which left quite perplexed all those who saw Gómez as a country bumpkin who was only in the shadow of Castro. However, the war was far from over. Despite the victories, the situation remained complex for Castro's government and Gómez. Banker Manuel Antonio Matos was operating a ship that distributed weapons along the Venezuelan coast. In addition, the revolutionaries had already managed to take over much of the country, except for the Andes and the central region, which had been pacified by Gómez. Venezuela had not experienced such an anarchic and violent time since the Federal War. Gómez returns to Caracas, and in March 1902 he goes out on campaign again, to fight in Coro against several renowned revolutionary leaders whom he defeated formidably. After this, he departed to the coasts of Cumana, where the most important leaders of the liberating revolution were located, Generals Domingo Monagas and Nicolas Rolando, with a large and well-armed army. On May 3rd, Gómez disembarked, besieged, and took Cumana. 3 days later, he attacked Carúpano, where he received a bullet that almost killed him, so he had to be transferred back to Caracas. Manuel Antonio Matos landed in Huaria on May 15th and declared himself the supreme leader of the revolution. In turn, the governor of Guayana, who held the position on behalf of Castro, handed over Ciudad Bolívar to the revolutionaries with the cry of "Death to the Andeans." All of the east of the country was in the hands of the rebels, and a good part of the west was in dispute. As if that were not enough, the revolutionaries not only received money from large American companies, but the English and German railways, as well as the French cable company, also helped them. Cipriano Castro decided that it was time to declare himself in military campaign and prevent the meeting of the revolutionaries from the east with those who were in the west. So he leaves Gómez in charge of the Presidency of the Republic. Castro grouped all his forces in Victory, while all the revolutionary rebels concentrated in Villa de Cura. On the revolutionary side were 14,000 well-equipped men, with a dozen experienced generals, while the government had only 7,000 men accompanying Castro. There, in Victory, in October, the bloodiest battle with the most warriors in all of Venezuelan history began to be fought. The mountainous terrain and the lack of unity of command on the other side favored Castro. However, his forces were smaller and he had to desperately ask Gómez to send a reinforcement battalion, to which Gómez responded in a telegram, "I will not send you the battalion you ask for. I will go myself with 1,000 men I have gathered promptly." I will destroy any forces that stand in my way, and when I get there, I will attack the enemy from the rear. And so it was. The arrival of Gómez's reinforcements was decisive so that, after 13 days of combat, Castro's forces defeated the enemy in this historic battle. Demoralized and diminished, the warlords scattered throughout the country. So Gómez, this introverted landowner with no military or political experience, had become the primary man of the government and the main military leader of the country. But the job was not yet done. On one hand, in a parallel episode, a few weeks later, the Republic of Venezuela suffered one of the worst external aggressions it has ever endured. The blockade of the Venezuelan coasts by England, Germany, and Italy. Did the revolutionaries have the decency to agree on a truce with Castro while this matter was being resolved? But they remained a significant threat to the government. Once the blockade issue was resolved, the revolution was reactivated again. So in April of that year, Gómez left the capital again to fight the rebels. And in El Guapo, he defeated a large army of General Nicolas Rolando. In turn, on May 3rd, he decisively defeated the remaining revolutionary leaders in the West. But the battle with which Gómez sealed the triumph of peace in Venezuela took place in Ciudad Bolívar, a city that had historically been considered impossible to conquer. There was General Nicolas Rolando, fortified and leading the last bastion of the revolution. But in record time, in 3 days and 3 nights, Gómez manages to defeat the rebel leaders in this city. Finally, the liberating revolution had been defeated, and with it, Gómez sealed national peace on July 21st, 1903, thus putting an end to the bloody history of civil wars in Venezuela. He was welcomed in Caracas with acclamations and triumphal arches as the pacifier of Venezuela. To the astonishment of many, this quiet man from Táchira proved to be an exceptional military leader. But if his work as a military man during this conflict was crucial for the country, even more so would be his work as a governing ruler. Gómez served as vice president of Venezuela under the mandate of Cipriano Castro, and his figure was gaining more and more prominence. Castro's reckless, verbose, bold, and irate attitude contrasted with Gómez's quiet, sensible, firm, and intelligent behavior. This caused mistrust between Gómez and Castro, and although on several occasions Castro had reprehensible behaviors against Gómez, which caused great political tension in the country, Gómez always remained loyal to his compadre. There is no doubt about that, and it is recorded. A group of Caracas and Valencia supporters of Castro even dared to conspire against the life of Juan Vicente Gómez in the episode called The Conspiracy, when Castro became seriously ill, and they were afraid that Gómez would assume power as Castro's successor. During the conspiracy, Gómez never slept in the same house for 2 nights in a row. But when he recovered, Castro was very annoyed that his supporters saw him as dead, while Gómez had remained attentive to his care. So he displaced several of these supporters from his inner circle from the important positions they were occupying. Despite all this, the government remained united. Although Castro's turbulent politics were not producing good results for the country, by 1980, in addition to numerous social problems, Venezuela had huge debts, and the nation, moreover, had entered a very conflictive situation. With several foreign powers that had once again intervened in their customs and could easily threaten the country's sovereignty, the country found itself in a fragile, chaotic situation, desperately seeking order and tranquility. And in the midst of this difficult situation, President Cipriano Castro falls seriously ill again and has to travel to Berlin for surgery. His death was more than likely, and Gómez had already begun making preparations for this scenario. Immediately after the departure of the president from the country, public demonstrations against Castro began to occur. At the same time, several of the supporters of Castroism, especially those who had been displaced from their positions, began to conspire in favor of his overthrow. While the circle of Andeans loyal to Gómez would obey any decision their leader made until death. In this way, Juan Vicente Gómez, in a very calculated and planned manner, decided to execute the maneuver that would mark his life and that of the country forever. He imprisoned the few military and political leaders who remained loyal to Castro and developed a legal maneuver in which he took refuge in the current constitution to formally assume power as vice president in charge of the presidency, and with it also appoint a completely new cabinet. After this, the entire country applauded this measure. The rehabilitative revolution was a peaceful one, without any violence or gunfire. A crowd in Bolivar Square gave a standing ovation to the new government. The interior states expressed their adherence, and Congress also recognized it. If this was a coup d'etat, as some historians believe, it would have been the most constitutional coup d'etat in the history of Venezuela. Romulo Gallegos, who would become a famous writer and Venezuelan president, wrote the following weeks after Gómez's takeover, abro comillas, "It seems that the signs announcing the advent of that political miracle from a long time ago can be noticed, expected as the only effective solution to the complex problem of our Republican nationality. The revolution that we have just witnessed within peace and in a few days has never had a selfish motive and is unrelated to the duties of patriotism, and this is the supreme reason that justifies it." End quote. In this way, acclaimed by the country, on December 19, 1908, the government of Juan Vicente Gómez begins, who ruled in Venezuela as its undisputed leader until his death in 1935. One of the first things Gómez did once in power was to successfully re-establish the link with these countries that were threatening Venezuela so that they could negotiate and avoid war. Venezuela then enters international arbitration, and this ends up siding with the Venezuelan government to reach a fair agreement. In a very short time, Gómez manages to solve the problem with the powers that the nation had been carrying for quite a few years. It is also essential to point out that in his first presidential term, Gómez formed one of the most inclusive and broadest governments in the history of Venezuela. Leaders from all political sectors who until very recently were fighting each other with guns were included in both his cabinet and his government council. All of Castro's political prisoners were released and thousands of exiles returned to the country. Broad freedoms were also offered to the press, and new newspapers and magazines emerged. A couple of years later, when some factors of the old caudillista politics began to conspire against the government, it's that the Gómez regime adopts the characteristics of a dictatorship, but with the approval of a large part of the country. It's crucial to stress this point. And unlike the Castro government, many of the relevant positions in the administration were occupied by Andeans close to Gómez. And in turn, the executive power surrounded itself with several of the most prestigious intellectuals and professionals of the time. Now, it has been said a lot that Gómez was a cruel person who dedicated himself to persecuting the opponents of his regime while plunging the country into its worst backwardness. This is a partisan narrative of Venezuelan history without any serious support, which is based on fictional accounts like Memories of a Venezuelan of Decadence by José Rafael Pocatera, or in the historical vision promoted by his future adversaries, which claims that this alleged tyrant kept the country in the darkness of repression for 27 years. The reality and truth are the complete opposite. The first thing we must say is that Gómez's government was supported by a political and legal vision of a number of Venezuelan intellectuals. They believed that for a country to achieve true democracy, that country must first go through a process of gradual political evolution before reaching that democratic state. That democracy is not something that can be decreed by force. We're talking about intellectuals like Laureano Valentí Lalance, José Gil Fortul, Pedro Manuel Arcaya, among others, heavily influenced by European positivism. But above all, by the awareness that Venezuelan problems require Venezuelan solutions. And what about the issue of political repression? On one hand, no one was ever executed during his term, and the majority of those captured in the small armed conspiracies that were against Gómez's government, they did not spend more than a few months or years in prison, as there were numerous political amnesties given by Juan Vicente Gómez. Those who were imprisoned in La Rotunda for a long time, like the case of Roman Delgado Chalbaut, were really the exception. This does not deny that there was repression against politicians and against media outlets that proved to be extremely harmful to the stability of the country. It's good to put things into perspective. And to put the situation into perspective, it should also be said that all these practices that took place during the Gomechismo, including the tortures, were carried out by previous governments, as well as by several of the democratic governments that followed it, even on a larger scale. On the other hand, the famous La Rotunda prison, used by his government and often the most mentioned by his detractors, wasn't even built by Gómez. This prison already existed since 1854 and had previously been used by previous governments. In turn, there are many cases of people who were radical opponents to Gómez, who later ended up in important positions in his government, as well as the cases of flatterers to Gómez who did not receive any position of relevance. The prison situation in Venezuela during Gómezism is not what has been painted. Rather, one of the most devastating facts is that the number of prisoners in Venezuela decreased between 1908 and 1935. The myths about Gómez extend beyond the topic of political prisoners. The reality is also very contrary to the popular narrative when it comes to institutional development, economic, educational, and infrastructure development. More than in darkness, it can be objectively stated that Venezuela during the Gomechismo experienced progress like it had never seen before. Under the motto of union, peace, and work, Juan Vicente Gómez managed to institutionally and territorially unite a country that was disintegrated. He brought peace by putting an end to caudillismo and constantly promoted the value of work. In addition to promoting infrastructure and an economy that was hit by civil wars, a great fiscal disorder, and serious problems caused by foreign debt. In 1920, an article by a journalist from the Times of London said the following quote, "Since I visited Venezuela 6 years ago, the progress and national prosperity have been enormous. No one can deny that remarkable progress has been made, and that the strong hand guiding the republic is directed by a brain endowed with practical sense and clear vision." End quote. A transcendental matter is that by then, in Venezuela, no one had managed to consolidate a national and professional army that responded to a single command. To advance in territorial and institutional union, and to bury the eternal vicious cycle of armed revolutions that continued to be a threat. Gómez manages to create a national army that served Venezuela and not the regional warlords. Rather than a simple reorganization of the army, Gómez dismantled what existed and created something new and different. The armed forces were institutionalized in doctrine, organization, and material. New bodies such as aviation and the General Inspectorate were founded. Just as many new military facilities and officer training academies were founded in order to professionalize, integrate, centralize, and discipline the troops, both the new cadets and the old caudillista montoneros. In these days, the notion of the Venezuelan army as the direct heir of Simon Bolivar's army began to be sown. When the centenary of independence was celebrated in 1911, the Venezuelan people could see that their military forces finally looked and functioned like a real army. At the same time, by then, there were also two essential elements missing for the functioning of any nation. On one hand, a unified and organized public administration, and on the other, a coherent long-term public works project. Juan Vicente Gómez, characterized for being very methodical and orative, as well as someone who understood the importance of infrastructure for national development, set out to seriously address both issues. This task was led by Roman Cardenas, who was first Minister of Public Works until 1912, and then Minister of Finance until 1922. Cardenas executed the first public works plan that has been made in the history of Venezuela, which included a national plan for communication routes, aqueducts, and sanitation works. So during this time, several of the major highways that Venezuela has today were built, like the famous Transandina Highway. The first airports, the first bus terminals, and airlines in the country were also created, as well as numerous bridges and buildings. And as if this wasn't enough for this respectable doctor, under his management as Minister of Finance, Cárdenas managed to unify, sanitize, and create the modern public treasury of Venezuela. His reforms to tax legislation and the operation of the treasury provided a solid administrative and economic base for the Venezuelan state, which had an enviable economic performance for the rest of the world in the following decades. A situation that stands out even more when considering that before Gómez, Venezuela had come from more than 50 years of terrible economic stagnation. One of the many proofs of this is that when Gómez died, the country had substantial monetary reserves. It is precisely the consolidation of a national army and the institutionalization of a healthy public administration which leads to cataloging the Benemerito as the creator of the modern Venezuelan state. Oil exploitation in Venezuela began during Gómez's presidency. In the absence of national capitals and professionals who were capable of exploiting this item, at that time several foreign companies were welcome to exploit it. And in this way, significant capital also arrived in the country's economy. In this matter, the work of Gumercindo Torres was crucial in negotiating and fighting against foreign oil companies in order to achieve a fair profit relationship between the state and the oil companies. The work of Gumercindo Torres was so persistent that even the United States Department of State came to consider this Gómez's minister as the main enemy of American interests in oil matters in Venezuela. So it is also false that the Gómez government was some sort of puppet of the United States. Another proof of this was Gómez's firm decision to remain neutral during World War I, despite the strong pressures the United States was putting on Venezuela to take a side in their favor. The topic of Gómezismo in the United States is one of many significant points about Juan Vicente Gómez that will be discussed further in upcoming videos. But it's also another myth that the Venezuelan economy at this time grew only because of an oil issue. Prior to and during the exploitation, there was a significant improvement in agricultural production that was heavily promoted by Juan Vicente Gómez, as well as in other areas of the economy that had times, decades, without enjoying such a lasting peace. Was the economic situation so favorable in those years? Thanks to these achievements, Venezuela was one of the few countries in the world that was not affected by the global crisis, from 1928 by the 1929 crash. And another fact whose significance is worthy of study and which shows the healthiness of public accounts, it was in 1930 when the country managed to cancel the entirety of the internal and external debt of the Republic, in tribute to the centenary of the death of the liberator Simon Bolivar Miran. Not being subject to debts is one of the greatest aspirations a country can have in terms of its sovereignty and its well-being. A reflection of the magnitude of this fact is that Venezuela was the only country in the world in this debt-free situation at that time. On the other hand, very fundamental. Although Gómez is also accused of being an illiterate who despised education, his government did not lag behind in educational matters. Thanks to the work of men like Rubén González Cárdenas, the primary school enrollment grew from 25,000 students in 1909 to 150,000 students in 1934. In this way, strengthening public education over private education. When Gómez died, he left a country with twice as many schools as there were when he took power. The Ministry of Public Instruction organized a vast project in 1930 with the goal of fighting illiteracy in Venezuela. For this purpose, schools were built for illiterate adults. And during all those years, basic schools, commercial schools, arts and crafts schools, and agricultural schools were also inaugurated at the national level. Notably, during his administration, the academic work of several of Venezuela's greatest intellectuals was also funded. Last but not least, after encountering a health system that was extremely backward and practically non-existent, the Gómez government promoted the first serious and comprehensive diagnosis of the country's health situation. By 1911, and during his term, the foundations of a national public health system were established. which after his government would continue to evolve positively over time. In summary, the result of Gómezism was a Venezuela that was safer, less poor, more orderly, more institutional, and more educated than the caudillista Venezuela of the 19th century. Juan Vicente Gómez died on the same day as Simón Bolívar, December 17, but in 1935. His life was extraordinary, as was his government work. With silent cunning, with his talent scarce of experience, he managed to impose himself over all the other anarchic ambitions of the country. And although history has been in charge of judging him negatively for a long time, the study of his era leaves no doubt that at the time he was acclaimed by the nation as the necessary man to seal peace and introduce Venezuela into the 20th century. Thus, Gómez was Venezuela's most significant 20th century figure. Because without him, a modern state would not have been consolidated that allowed the construction of Venezuela, a power that once existed. His transcendental work distinguishes him from any other man of his time. He did not die frustrated like many men who thought that only willpower was enough to change history. Gómez died knowing that he had forever transformed Venezuela with unity, peace, and work. Thank you very much for watching this material. I hope it has helped you to better know this man, to better know our history. As always, I remind you to share this video if you found it valuable, subscribe to the channel, leave your comments, suggestions, questions. This is the New Encyclopedia, a way to better understand our world, our culture, our history, and, well, better understand the whole environment that surrounds us. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.